The package room in my building had all the charm of a utility closet and twice the fluorescent lighting. I was there because a pair of replacement door sensors had been delivered to the wrong unit, and because after 11 years of living alone, I had become the kind of person who considered retrieving a package at 6:30 on a Tuesday a legitimate evening activity. I found the box on the bottom shelf, crouched to pull it free, and saw the label on the parcel beside it. Matthew Sloane. For a few seconds, the name was only a name. Then my brain supplied the rest of him with cruel efficiency. The dark hair he used to cut himself because he hated paying for something that grew back. The scar near his right thumb from opening a wine bottle with a pocket knife. The way he said my full name, only when he was angry or trying not to laugh. I looked at the address. Unit 5C. I lived in 5B. There were probably hundreds of Matthew Sloanes in America, maybe thousands. I was still calculating the odds when someone behind me said, "Wes?" Nobody had called me that in years. I stood too quickly and hit my shoulder on the metal shelving. The pain was useful. It gave me something immediate to dislike. Matthew was standing in the doorway with one hand still on the handle. 15 years had changed him in ways I recognized before I understood them. His hair was shorter, threaded with a little gray at the temples. He wore glasses now. His face had sharpened around the jaw and softened around the eyes. He looked older, obviously. So did I. But he also looked settled somehow, which was the last word I would have used for him at 28. He stared at me with the same expression I was probably giving him. Then he looked at the package in my hands, at the label on the shelf, and back at me. "You live here." It came out almost accusingly. Apparently, his mouth twitched. I hated how quickly I remembered that twitch. "Which unit?" 5B. Matthew blinked once. "You're kidding. You're 5C. I signed the closing papers 9 days ago. I've been here 4 years. We stood in the package room, like two men trying to establish which one of us had committed the larger logistical offense. Finally, I said, "Did you know?" "No." The answer came too fast to be polished. I studied him anyway. Matthew let out a quiet breath. "Wesley, I did not move into this building because you live here. The use of my full name helped. Not because I believed him more, but because it sounded exactly like the man I remembered when he wanted to make sure I understood something. I didn't say you did. You have the same face you used to make when you were about to ask a question you'd already answered for me." That seems unfairly specific after 15 years. I had practice. There it was. Not nostalgia exactly. More like finding an old reflex still stored somewhere in the body. I picked up my package. "Well, welcome to the building. Thanks." Neither of us moved. Then Matthew said, "Are you okay?" It was such an ordinary question that it nearly undid me. "I'm standing in a package room with the man I almost married, so I'm going to need a more precise definition of okay." He laughed once, surprised, and I did too. The sound loosened something without making anything easier. "I didn't know," he said again. This time I nodded. "I believe you." That was all we could manage. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, which would have been a stronger gesture if we hadn't lived on the 5th floor. At 7:15, I was leaving again, because I had decided I needed toothpaste urgently enough to justify walking 3 blocks to the pharmacy. The elevator opened, and Matthew was inside wearing a dark jacket, one hand in his pocket. He looked at me. I looked at him. "This is going to happen a lot, isn't it?" he asked. "Statistically, yes. I was hoping you'd say the building had 2 separate circulation systems. I audit public accessibility, Matthew. I'd have complained already." The elevator doors closed. He smiled at the floor numbers. "Still doing that? Accessibility consulting? Yes. You used to point out bad ramps on dates. They were bad ramps. You once stopped in the middle of an argument to complain about a restaurant threshold. It was almost 2 inches. I remember. That word changed the air more than it should have. We reached the lobby. Outside, he nodded left. I'm walking around the block. I was going right. At least, I had been. "Pharmacy," I said, as if presenting evidence. "Very exciting. I've built a rich life." "I can see that. I should have left." Instead, I said, 1 block. Matthew glanced at me. What? I'll walk 1 block. Then I'm going to buy toothpaste, like a man with priorities. He nodded, and we turned left together. The first block was mostly neutral territory, building complaints, neighborhood changes, the bakery that had replaced a laundromat. A bus stop moved half a block for reasons neither of us understood. We spoke the way people do when the important subject is standing directly between them and both have agreed not to touch it. At the corner, Matthew stopped. Well, he said. Well, my pharmacy was back the other way. Neither of us moved. Then he asked, 1 more block? I looked down the street. Fine. The second block was harder. He asked where I had lived after Boston. I asked where he had gone after Seattle. We discovered our lives had crossed states without crossing cities. I had spent 6 years in Chicago before moving to Providence for work. He had moved constantly for architectural photography, then settled in Denver for nearly 7 years before coming east. 7 years sounds almost domestic for you, I said. He glanced at me. I was in a relationship. The sentence landed with embarrassing force. I kept walking. How long? 7 years. Oh. His name was Aaron. I was grateful Matthew gave me the name. It prevented me from turning the man into a faceless obstacle in a story that had ended long ago. We broke up 2 years ago, he added. I'm sorry. Thank you. We walked another few steps. Then he said, You? I could have lied through omission. Instead, I told him about Daniel, 3 years, Marcus, 18 months, a handful of shorter relationships that were not failures simply because they ended. Matthew listened, without asking the question neither of us had earned yet. No one said, Did you ever think about me? That restraint mattered. The next morning, I woke before my alarm and spent several minutes staring at the ceiling as if it had personally arranged Matthew's real estate transaction. By 7, I had decided on 3 things. First, I believed he had not moved next door because of me. Second, that did not make the situation less complicated. Third, I needed rules. Rules were useful because they gave anxiety the appearance of project management. I found Matthew outside our building just after 8, camera bag over one shoulder and coffee in his hand. He saw me, slowed, and said, You look like you've prepared an agenda. I hated that he could still recognize that expression. I have 1 item. That's how agendas start. We should decide how to do this. He looked toward the building. Live next door? You know what I mean. His smile faded into something more careful. Yeah, I do. We stood near the bike rack while commuters passed us. I don't want us pretending we don't know each other, I said. Matthew nodded. Neither do I. But I also don't want every hallway conversation turning into a forensic investigation of who ruined 2011. That seems fair. And I don't want to call this a second chance. He looked at me for a moment. Good. The answer surprised me enough that I stopped speaking. Matthew took a sip of coffee. A second chance at what, exactly? We're not 26 and 28 anymore. I don't even own the jacket you hated. The brown leather one? You said it made me look like a substitute teacher who joined a motorcycle club. It did. See, some things survive. I laughed despite myself. He added, I'm not interested in restoring an old relationship, Wes. I'm interested in not being weird every time I collect my mail. Ambitious. I'm trying to grow. That should have settled something. Instead, it made seeing him easier. Easier was dangerous, because it did not announce itself. It arrived in ordinary increments. A text at 6 asking if I was walking. A knock on my door because the building management had sent him the wrong recycling schedule, and apparently, I looked like a man who knew municipal policy. A 5-minute conversation near the elevators that became 20 because Matthew had discovered the bakery downstairs sold excellent almond cookies, and I had opinions about the structural irresponsibility of buying only 2. We did not discuss the engagement every night. We did not exchange emotional biographies. We simply stopped acting as if 15 years required ceremonial handling. By the following Tuesday, Our evening walks had become regular enough that when Matthew texted, "Running late, 20 minutes?" I automatically replied, "Fine," without asking myself whether agreeing meant anything. The walks changed in small ways. At first, we stayed on streets I knew. Then Matthew began choosing routes I had never taken, despite living in Providence for 4 years. He noticed light on brick walls, fire escapes, old carved stone above storefronts I had passed hundreds of times without looking up. I noticed curb cuts, uneven paving, badly placed outdoor tables and entrances people had made beautiful without making usable. We had always seen cities differently. At 26, I had thought that difference meant one of us was paying attention and the other was distracted. Now I understood we were simply collecting different evidence. One evening, Matthew stopped across from a narrow old theater and lifted his phone to photograph the marquee reflected in a puddle. "You still do that," I said. "What?" "Stop in the middle of walking, because light did something interesting." He lowered the phone. "You still stop because concrete did something offensive. Concrete has responsibilities." He laughed, and we kept going. There were moments when memory tried to take over. I would notice the way he rolled his sleeves, or the slight crease between his eyebrows when he concentrated, and suddenly I was 27 again, watching him sketch travel routes on restaurant napkins. But present-day Matthew kept interrupting the memory. He wore glasses when editing photographs now, because years of screen work had changed his vision. He hated cilantro, which was new. He had learned to cook properly. He went to bed earlier. He called his mother every Sunday. He had opinions about mattress quality that would have horrified the man who once slept happily on an airport floor because the next flight was cheaper. The familiarity was real. So was the distance. I realized one Thursday that I had begun wanting details. Not evidence, not explanations, details. I wanted to know which grocery store he preferred, why he had stopped drinking beer, whether he still read on planes even though he barely flew anymore, what kind of work bored him now, what kind frightened him. These were not questions about the man I had lost. They belonged to the man walking beside me. That distinction bothered me more than nostalgia would have. Nostalgia had an expiration date. Curiosity did not. Matthew seemed to understand the difference before I said anything. He never told me. "You remember." He would say, "I do this now," or "I changed my mind about that," as if giving me permission to meet him without pretending recognition was knowledge. A week after he moved in, we took a longer route along the river. Matthew had worked late, and by the time we left the building, most of the dinner crowd had disappeared. He told me about a historic school renovation he was photographing. I told him about a museum consultation where the design team had managed to install an accessible restroom behind a door too heavy for half the intended users to open. "You get personally offended by bad design," he said. "I get professionally offended." "No, professionally offended is calm." "You were furious describing that door, because someone had to look at the drawing and approve it. There he is." "Who?" "The man who once wrote a 3-paragraph complaint because a hotel called 3 steps an accessible entrance." I looked at him. "It was not accessible." "I know." His voice softened. "You were right. 15 years ago, I would have heard triumph in that. Now I heard affection, and I did not know what to do with it." We reached a railing near the river. For a while we watched the water. Then, without looking at me, Matthew said, "Aaron used to make fun of me for photographing buildings nobody hired me to photograph." I knew immediately who he meant. In a good way? Mostly. He said I couldn't walk past a window without assigning it emotional significance. Sounds exhausting. He was a patient man. I waited. Matthew added, "We were good for a long time." There was no apology in the sentence. No attempt to protect me from the fact that he had loved someone after me. Oddly, that made it easier to breathe. "What happened?" He glanced at me. "You sure you want to know?" I asked. "We wanted different things eventually." "That sounds familiar." "Yeah." He gave a small, humorless smile. Except I was the one who wanted to stay. That landed harder than I expected. I looked back at the river. And he didn't? He got offered a position in Vancouver. It was exactly what he wanted. Did you ask him not to go? Matthew was quiet long enough that I turned toward him. Yes, he said. I did. The answer rearranged something in me. And he went anyway? He did. We tried distance for a while. Didn't work. I almost said, so now you understand. The thought was ugly enough that I was relieved I caught it before it reached my mouth. Matthew had not told me this to balance a ledger. He had simply answered the question. Still, part of me wondered whether losing someone to movement had taught him what I had tried to teach him 15 years earlier. Another part knew people were not lessons assigned by the universe. He looked over at me. Daniel was 3 years? Yes. What happened? Fair was fair. He wanted us to move in together. Matthew waited. And I didn't. Because I liked my apartment. Matthew gave me a look. Don't. I didn't say anything. Your face did. I sighed. Daniel said we had been together 3 years and still lived like people who expected to break up cleanly. Matthew's expression changed. Not victory. Recognition. Was he right? About some of it. Which part? The clean part. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets. I like knowing where my things are. I like having my own money, my own schedule, my own space. I don't think that's pathological. I didn't say it was. Daniel did. Did he? Not exactly. Matthew's mouth twitched. There's the attorney for the defense. I laughed. You are incredibly annoying for someone who spent 15 years not speaking to me. I could speak less. Don't threaten me with peace. We started walking again. Neither of us tried to summarize what our later relationships proved. Aaron did not prove Matthew had forgotten me. Daniel did not prove I was incapable of commitment. They were men we had loved, not evidence in a case about each other. That mattered to me. Maybe more than I wanted to admit. The younger version of me would have needed our old relationship to remain singular in order to feel important. At 41, I knew better. Something could end, matter enormously, and still not be the only thing that ever mattered. When we reached our building, Matthew checked the time. I have an early shoot tomorrow. Then no extra block. Responsible of you. I'm growing too. He smiled. Good night, Wes. Good night. He went inside first. I stayed on the sidewalk for a moment, looking toward the corner we usually turned. I realized I did not want our next conversation to happen because we lived beside each other. I did not want a hallway, a mailroom, or a walking habit to make the decision for us. So before I could analyze it into something safer, I pulled out my phone. There's a place on Wickenden I've been meaning to try, I typed. I stared at the message, deleted the phrase "if you're free," then typed something clearer. Dinner Saturday? Matthew's reply came less than a minute later. Yes. Then another message. Somewhere we've never been? I looked at it for a long time before answering. Exactly. Saturday arrived with the kind of ridiculous anticipation I had not experienced since my 30s and had assumed age would eventually cure. It had not. I changed shirts twice, which annoyed me enough that I put the first one back on out of principle. Matthew texted at 6:45. Ready when you are. I opened my door and found him standing in the hallway at the same moment. For a second, neither of us spoke. He wore a charcoal sweater under a dark coat. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed to remind me of 28-year-old Matthew. That was probably why I noticed him so much. You look nice, he said. So do you. He glanced toward the elevator. Good. We've completed the terrifying portion of the evening. We haven't even ordered. I've seen you choose from a menu. That was 15 years ago. You alphabetized takeout options by cuisine. That sounds efficient. It was deeply unsettling. The restaurant was small, noisy enough to prevent solemnity, and unfamiliar enough that no table belonged to our past. I had chosen it for exactly that reason. No booth where we had celebrated an anniversary, no bartender who might remember us, no dish that carried emotional jurisdiction. Matthew noticed. You did research. I looked at reviews. You looked at floor plans. I checked accessibility. There he is. The first 10 minutes felt almost suspiciously easy. We argued about appetizers. Matthew ordered something with cilantro, then remembered he hated cilantro and stared at the plate as if betrayal had occurred. You told me you hated it now. I forgot. You developed the opinion and forgot the opinion? I contain multitudes. You contain poor documentation. He laughed, and the sound settled me. That was what surprised me most about the evening. Not chemistry. Chemistry had existed before. Familiarity had existed before. It was how little effort the conversation required once we stopped treating history as the main event. Matthew told me about a courthouse restoration where the project architect had insisted on preserving an original staircase nobody could safely use. I told him about an arts center director who had called accessibility modifications visual compromises until I asked which visitors he considered aesthetically acceptable. Matthew raised his glass, still terrifying people professionally. I prefer educating. You terrified me into recycling correctly. You lived in Seattle, you should have known. I was young. You were 30. Practically fetal. We talked about work, then money, then aging parents. Matthew's mother had moved to a smaller place outside Worcester. My father had developed a fascination with online genealogy and now sent me long messages about distant relatives who died before electricity. The conversation kept moving forward. That mattered. Eventually, Matthew said, "Can I ask something slightly dangerous? Your definition of slightly is historically unreliable. Why Providence?" I considered the question. The job brought me here. That's the first answer. I looked at him. He waited. I had forgotten this about him. Matthew could be impatient with logistics and remarkably patient with people. At 26, I had often confused those traits. I stayed because it was manageable, I said. Manageable good? Open your heart. Manageable, predictable. He nodded slowly. My office is 15 minutes away. The airport is close enough. My building is decent. I know the neighborhood. You like your life? I do. That sounded defensive. It wasn't. It had legal counsel. I smiled despite myself. I like knowing what happens next. Matthew looked down at his plate. You didn't used to. Yes, I did. No. You wanted to know where home was. That's different. The accuracy irritated me. You're getting philosophical over roasted carrots. I'm adapting. I studied him. And you? Why here? I wanted a smaller radius. That's romantic. It gets better. Regional work. Less flying. Fewer hotel rooms. My mother is 45 minutes away. 2 friends are here. And Aaron? The name left my mouth before I decided whether I should use it. Matthew did not flinch. No, Aaron's still in Vancouver. Do you talk? Occasionally. I nodded. Matthew leaned back. Are you asking if there's unfinished business? I'm asking if you talk. That was an impressively clean sentence. Thank you. There isn't. I believed him. More importantly, I did not feel relieved in the way I expected. Aaron was not competition. Neither was Daniel. Our lives had happened. The strange thing was that acknowledging those years made the evening feel more real, not less. Matthew looked toward the window. I used to think if we ever saw each other again, it would be dramatic. What did you imagine? I don't know. Airport, wedding, funeral. Efficient. Covers the major reunion categories. I never imagined package room. No one does. He smiled. Then his expression changed. I also assumed you'd hate me. I put down my fork. I did. For a while. How long? Long enough to be boring about it. That sounds serious. I was excellent at being wronged. Matthew gave a quiet laugh, but I did not. I told people you chose work over me. His eyes returned to mine. That wasn't completely false. No. I appreciated that he did not rush to absolve himself. But it wasn't complete either, I said. Matthew waited. I said go. You did. I wanted you to refuse. I know that now. I don't think I knew it then. He looked surprised. I continued before courage became analysis. I thought if I had to ask you to stay, then staying wouldn't count. The restaurant noise seemed to move farther away. Matthew rubbed his thumb against the stem of his glass. I thought if you really wanted me there, he said, you'd tell me. We were idiots. We were in love. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No. We sat with that. It was the first time we had touched the actual breakup without turning it into a trial. No defendant. No verdict. Just two men admitting that love had existed beside behavior that made love almost impossible to use. After dinner, we walked toward the river instead of home. Matthew did not ask whether we were having a date. Neither did I. The air had cooled, and the streets were busy near the restaurants but quieter, closer to the water. We stopped near a low stone wall. Matthew said, "This is going to sound strange. Tonight has room." "I'm glad you had relationships after me." I looked at him. He added quickly, "Not glad they ended. Thank you for clarifying. I mean, I'm glad I wasn't the last time you tried." The sentence landed somewhere tender. "I'm glad you loved Aaron," I said. Matthew's eyebrows lifted. "I'm not thrilled about the mental images, obviously. That's generous. I'm evolving." He laughed. Then neither of us moved. There was a moment when the shape of the evening became impossible to misread. Matthew was close enough that I could see the silver beginning near his temples. He looked at my mouth once. Only once. 15 years ago, I would have waited. I would have needed him to move first so I could call whatever happened his decision. I was tired of that version of myself, so I stepped closer. Matthew's expression changed. "Wes." I kissed him. There was no shock in the kiss. That surprised me. No cinematic collapse of 15 years. No sense that time had folded or fate had corrected itself. He simply kissed me back, warmly, carefully at first, then with enough certainty that my hand found the front of his coat and stayed there. When we separated, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Matthew exhaled. "Well," I laughed quietly, "that's what you've got? I had something better before you did that. Tragic." He looked at me with an expression I remembered and did not. "This isn't 2011, he said. "I know. I don't want us confusing wanting each other with knowing what comes next." There it was. Old Matthew would have run toward possibility. Current Matthew wanted definitions before momentum. I should have been frightened by the uncertainty. Instead, I felt strangely calm. "Good," I said. He searched my face. "Good? I don't want what comes next decided by what almost happened before." Matthew nodded. We walked home without touching, not because we regretted the kiss, because neither of us needed to prove it had happened. At our building entrance, Matthew reached for the door, then stopped. "So what do we call tonight?" I considered it. "Dinner." That's severe. It was good dinner. And the part by the river? Also good. He smiled. I looked at him, and for once I did not wait for implication to do all the work. "Have dinner with me again." Matthew's smile disappeared into something quieter. "Are you asking me on a date?" "Yes." He held my gaze. "Then yes." Our second date was 4 days later. Matthew chose a small Ethiopian place on the east side, where the tables were close together, and the owner greeted half the room by name. When I arrived, Matthew was already there. "You're early," I said. "So are you." "I'm 3 minutes early." "I'm 7. That's excessive." "I've changed." "You keep saying that. You keep auditing it." "Fair." We ordered too much food and argued about who had chosen the better dish. Matthew lost because he had underestimated the spice level and refused to admit it while drinking water like a man trying to survive a small chemical incident. It was easier than the first dinner. That made it more dangerous. The first dinner had history sitting at the table with us. This one did not. We talked about a photography exhibit Matthew wanted to see in Boston, a community center I was consulting on, whether people who owned decorative pillows actually enjoyed moving them every night before bed. At some point I realized I was not comparing him to who he had been. I was just on a date with Matthew. That distinction felt enormous. Afterward, we walked back toward the river. He reached for my hand halfway down the block. No hesitation, no speech, just his fingers against mine, and a second where I could have pulled away. I didn't. The contact was quiet enough to expose me. There was no dramatic urgency to hide behind. I simply liked holding his hand. The next few weeks were made of small decisions. Matthew did not assume proximity meant availability. I did not turn every invitation into evidence. If he was busy, he said so. If I wanted to see him, I asked. Sometimes he said no. The first time he did, my body reacted before my mind caught up. Friday? Can't. Dinner with my mother. The old reflex arrived instantly. Of course. There it is. The small withdrawal I had trained myself to detect. Then I read the message again. Dinner with my mother. Not avoidance. Not avoidance. Not retreat. A plan. He had even told me about it earlier. I typed, Sunday? Matthew replied, yes. That was it. No emotional forensic work required. Sunday afternoon, we drove to Bristol because Matthew wanted to photograph an old industrial building near the harbor. I nearly refused when he first asked. Why? He said. I don't know anything about photography. You know about buildings. That is not the same thing. I'm not hiring you. So what am I doing? Coming with me. The simplicity of it annoyed me. Just coming? Yes, Wesley. You don't need help carrying equipment? No. You're sure? Matthew leaned against his doorway. I am asking you to spend a day with me. There is no secondary assignment. I narrowed my eyes. You've rehearsed that. I've dated you before. That one. We spent 3 hours walking around the waterfront while Matthew worked. I watched him differently than I had 15 years ago. Back then, his attention had made me jealous of everything. Buildings, light, travel, projects, anything capable of taking him elsewhere. Now I saw how focused he became when he worked. How patient. How willing to stand in one place for 20 minutes because the light was wrong and leaving would not improve it. That amused me enough that I finally said, you know, this entire job is waiting. Matthew lowered his camera. What? You used to hate waiting. I matured. You are currently standing in a parking lot hoping a cloud moves. That cloud has no respect for composition. I'm just saying. He smiled. Say it. You learned patience. His smile softened. With some things. That evening, back in Providence, we had our first disagreement. Not about the past. Not about us. About dinner. Matthew wanted Thai. I wanted Italian. He made the mistake of saying, I don't care. Pick. I stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before noticing. What? You do care. Not much. You said Thai. And you said Italian. So now you don't care? Matthew stared at me. I heard myself. So did he. That wasn't about dinner, he said. No. He waited. I hated him for waiting well. I don't want you saying you don't care just because I want something different. Matthew's expression changed. Okay. That's it? What would you like me to do? Have an opinion. I do have one. Then keep it. All right. I want Thai. Good. What do you want? Italian. He nodded. Excellent. We have achieved conflict. I laughed despite myself. What now? Now we find a place that serves neither and resent everyone equally. We ended up eating burgers. It was stupid. It was also the first time I understood that disagreement did not automatically become distance. Nobody left. Nobody translated preference into a test. We just disagreed and ate fries. I slept at Matthew's place for the first time 2 nights later. Nothing about it felt like reclaiming territory. His apartment looked nothing like the places we had shared before. Different furniture, different books, different habits. He had developed an absurd devotion to expensive sheets. I mocked him until I got into bed. Then I apologized. In the morning, he made eggs while I stood barefoot in his kitchen wearing yesterday's shirt. The domestic ease of it scared me more than the kiss had. Matthew noticed. You're quiet. I'm eating. You're interrogating toast. I looked at him. Do you ever think about how easy this is? He turned off the stove. Yes. And I think easy is good. That's not what I meant. I know. I looked down at the plate. Matthew sat across from me. Wes, if you're asking whether I'm assuming anything because we're dating, I'm not. I'm not asking that. Then ask what you're asking. I almost told him never mind. Instead I said, how far ahead do you think? He leaned back slightly. With what? Life. That is a terrifyingly broad category for 8:15 in the morning. I'm serious. I know. He thought about it. Work, months, money, years, if I'm being responsible. Family stuff depends. And relationships? The pause was small, too small for anyone else to notice. I noticed. Matthew folded his hands around his mug. I try not to make promises early. We're not early. We've been dating 4 weeks. We were engaged 15 years ago. I'm aware. His voice stayed calm. That made mine sharper. I'm not asking you to propose. I know. Then why are you acting like I did? I'm not. You are. He exhaled. Wes, what do you actually want to know? The question irritated me, because I did not have the clean answer I expected. So I reached for the one symbol our history had already taught me to fear. Do you ever want to get married? Matthew went still. Not shocked. Not afraid. Just careful. I could practically see him refusing to give me the easy answer. Finally, he said, I don't know. The room became very quiet. You don't know. No. After everything? What does that mean? Nothing. It means something. I stood and carried my plate to the sink, though it was still half full. Matthew did not follow me. That restraint somehow made it worse. Behind me, he said, I can tell you what I do know. I turned. I want this. I want you. I'm not confused about that. But marriage? He met my eyes. I don't know if I want it. I did not leave angry. That would have been simpler. Anger gives you momentum. You can put on your shoes too quickly, close a door harder than necessary, and walk home carrying a clean version of events, where somebody hurt you, and you know exactly what to do with the injury. Instead, I stood beside his sink and felt something less useful. Afraid. Matthew stayed at the table. I don't want you hearing something I didn't say. I heard you. You heard that I don't know if I want to get married. That's different from not wanting a future with you. I looked at him. Is it? For me, yes. That seems convenient. His jaw tightened. There. The first real crack. Convenient how? You get to say you want me. You want this. You want whatever happens next. But the moment I ask what next actually means, uncertainty becomes some kind of virtue. That's not fair. No? No. Matthew stood, but he did not come closer. I spent years promising things because I thought a good relationship was supposed to have confident answers, where we'd live, what we'd do 5 years from now, whether I'd still want the same work. I got very good at sounding certain. And sometimes I wasn't. Aaron? His expression changed. Partly. I immediately regretted using the name like leverage. Matthew noticed. Don't do that. You brought him up. Not as evidence. Not as evidence. He was right. I folded my arms. So what am I supposed to do? Date you indefinitely until one morning you wake up certain? I didn't ask you to. Then what are you asking? Matthew was quiet. When he answered, his voice was lower. For you to decide what you actually need without making me say the correct sentence first. The words landed exactly where they were designed to. I laughed once without humor. That's rich. Probably. You spent 4 years with me the first time, waiting for me to tell you not to leave. I know. And now I'm supposed to admire how evolved you are, because you won't tell me whether you'd marry me? I'm not asking for admiration. No, just patience. No, that stopped me. Matthew held my eyes. I'm not asking you to wait for me, Wes. Something cold moved through me. He continued before I could answer. If marriage is something you know you want, and being with someone who doesn't know would make you unhappy, then you should take that seriously. So that's it? No. It sounds a lot like it. It sounds like I don't want to keep you by promising something because I'm scared you'll leave. 15 years earlier, I had wanted exactly that. A promise strong enough to stop movement. Now he was refusing to give me one. The strangest part was that some part of me respected him for it. Another part wanted to punish him for becoming principled, 15 years too late. I picked up my coat. Matthew said my name. I turned. He looked tired. Not dramatic. Not devastated. Just tired in the way adults look when a conversation has reached something neither person can solve by saying the same truth louder. I love being with you, he said. My hand froze on the sleeve. It was not a confession. Not exactly. We had not said love yet, and he did not say he loved me. He said he loved being with me. Precise. Careful. Matthew. That's not enough for me, I said. The pain on his face was immediate. I almost took it back. Instead, I left. For 3 days, we did what people in neighboring apartments do when they are trying not to encounter each other. We became excellent listeners. I learned when Matthew left for work from the quiet click of his door. He probably learned when I returned from the elevator. Neither of us texted. No walks. No one more block. At work, I buried myself in a library renovation that had reached the stage where everybody wanted final approval while continuing to change things I had already approved. It was perfect. I could be useful for 10 straight hours and call that emotional health. Near lunch, my coworker Priya dropped into the chair across from my desk. You look terrible. Thank you. You're welcome. Priya had known me 8 years and had developed the confidence of someone who understood I would eventually answer if she waited long enough. She opened a container of noodles. Matthew? I looked at her. I mentioned him once. You mentioned the man you almost married moving next door. That qualifies as memorable. We're not dating right now. Interesting phrasing. What would you prefer? You broke up? I don't know. That sounds worse. I told her enough. Not everything. Matthew's uncertainty. My reaction. The fact that he refused to promise marriage. The fact that I had told him what he offered was not enough. Priya listened. Then she asked, Do you want to get married? Yes. Too fast. She knew it. So did I. She leaned back. To Matthew? I don't know. Eventually. I don't know. Ever. I stared at her. This is becoming hostile. It's one question. It was 3. She ignored that. What do you want marriage to give you? Commitment. You can have commitment without marriage. I know. Legal protection? Useful. Public recognition? Maybe. Then what? I hated the answer before I said it. Proof. Priya stopped eating. There it was. Ugly because it was honest. I rubbed both hands over my face. If Matthew wanted to marry me now, it would mean he finally chose the thing he wouldn't choose then. Priya was quiet. And would that make you happy? I don't know. That's inconvenient. Deeply. She closed the lid on her lunch. You know what I think? Rarely stops you. I think you're asking a 43-year-old man to answer a question for the 28-year-old version of himself. I looked at her. And I think he's probably doing something equally stupid. That's usually how relationships work. That night, I did not go for a walk. I sat in my apartment and pulled up my calendar. It was almost empty beyond work. Not literally. There were appointments, dinners, my father's birthday, a dentist cleaning. But anything more than 6 weeks away was marked tentative. A friend had sent me an invitation to a cabin trip in October. I had answered, let me see. October was 5 months away. I had no conflict. I simply disliked becoming responsible to a future version of myself. I opened old messages. Daniel asking if I wanted to renew a lease together. Me saying we should revisit it later. Marcus suggesting Christmas with his family. Me saying flights might be difficult. A dozen tiny exits disguised as reasonable uncertainty. I had spent 15 years telling myself Matthew was the man who left. Somewhere along the way, I had built an entire life designed so nobody else could. The realization did not absolve him. That mattered. Matthew had left. Matthew had postponed visits. Matthew had expected me to translate love into flexibility I did not have. He had failed me. But the story I had told about our ending had only one active person in it. Him. That was not true either. I remembered the night we ended the engagement. Matthew had called from Seattle. It was late in Boston. Early enough there that I could hear traffic through his apartment window. We had been fighting for weeks about missed calls, postponed flights, and the next contract he had not decided whether to accept. Eventually he said, "Tell me what you want me to do." I had answered, "If you have to ask, that's the problem." For years, I had remembered that sentence as dignity. Now it sounded like a test with no correct answer, because I had refused to provide the question. The next afternoon, Matthew texted, "Can we talk?" My first instinct was to answer immediately. My second was to wait so I would not appear too eager. That made the decision for me. "Yes," I wrote. "Tonight?" His reply came almost at once. "Yes. And Wes?" I waited. "I don't think we should keep dating right now." I read the sentence 3 times. There was no cruelty in it. That did not make it hurt less. I typed, "Okay." Deleted it. Typed, "I understand." Deleted that too. Finally, I wrote the only honest thing I had. "I don't like that." Matthew replied, "Neither do I." Then another message. "But I think we need to know what we're choosing before we start asking each other to prove it." We met that evening on the sidewalk outside the building. Not in either apartment. That felt deliberate. Matthew had his hands in his coat pockets. I had spent most of the afternoon preparing arguments I no longer trusted. For a few seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then he said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For hurting you." That's not the same as being wrong. No. I appreciated that answer more than I wanted to. Matthew glanced toward the street where we usually walked. "I don't want to lose you again, because I was too afraid to say what I wanted." I waited. "But I also don't want to keep you by saying something I don't know yet." "Marriage." "Yes." I nodded. The word had already begun to feel different. Less like a destination, more like an examination neither of us had studied for. Matthew continued, "I know I want to be with you. I know I want this to matter. I know I'm not interested in dating other people. I know I want to make plans with you. But you don't know the ending." "No." I looked at him. "Neither do I." He went still. I almost laughed at his expression. "Don't look so shocked. I'm adjusting. I talked to Priya. That explains the emotional competence. Rude. Accurate." I took a breath. "I realized I've been asking you for certainty because I thought certainty would repair something." Matthew's face changed. "Us? The people we were." He looked down. "I wanted you to say you'd marry me because part of me thought that would prove you should have stayed 15 years ago. Wes." "I know." "No, I mean..." He stopped, then tried again. "I should have stayed long enough to understand what leaving actually meant to you." I shook my head. "You should have asked better questions." "Yes, and I should have answered them." Matthew watched me carefully. "I told you to go," I said. "Then I punished you for believing me. You were hurt. I was also dishonest. Not intentionally. It still counted." A car passed behind us. Neither of us spoke until the sound disappeared. Matthew said, "I kept thinking about the last time we broke up." "So did I. You said if I had to ask what you wanted, that was the problem." I winced. "I remember. I believed you. That was convenient." "Very." I smiled. He did too. The relief was small, but real. "I don't want to do that anymore," I said. "What?" "Make you guess correctly and call it love." Matthew stepped a little closer. Not touching. Just closer. I don't want to make uncertainty an excuse for never risking a promise, he said. That sounds suspiciously healthy. I've had a difficult week. So what happens now? Matthew looked at me for a long moment. I think we still stop. The answer hurt, but not like before. For how long? I don't know. I laughed softly. You really committed to the theme. He smiled, then became serious again. Not forever. I just think we need enough distance to make sure the next thing we do isn't panic. I considered it, then nodded. Okay. This time I meant it. We did not walk that night. For 11 days, we lived next door to each other, without being together. The first 3 were terrible. The 4th was merely unpleasant. By the 7th, something useful began happening. I stopped treating missing Matthew as proof that separation was wrong. Missing someone was information, not instruction. I went to dinner with Priya, visited my father, accepted the October cabin trip. That last one took approximately 30 seconds and felt absurdly significant. I opened the message, checked my calendar, asked myself whether I wanted to go. I did. So I wrote yes. No escape clause. No maybe. No let me see. The world did not collapse because I had made a plan 5 months away. A few days later, I registered for a professional conference in January. Then I laughed at myself because apparently, emotional development at 41 looked like registering early for continuing education. Matthew and I occasionally crossed paths. We said hello. Once we shared the elevator in silence until he noticed the conference brochure in my hand. January? Yes. You planning ahead? Don't make it weird. His smile stayed with me for the rest of the day. By the second week, I had a clearer answer to the question that started our fight. Did I want marriage? Maybe. Possibly. I liked what it could provide. I liked the idea of deliberately choosing a shared legal and social life. But what I needed from Matthew was not a proposal. What I needed was participation. I wanted to hear what he wanted before decisions were finished. I wanted him to risk influencing me. I wanted to be able to disagree with him without turning disagreement into abandonment. And I wanted to stop demanding guarantees from a future neither of us controlled. That did not mean accepting anything indefinitely. It meant deciding based on what was actually happening instead of forcing the present to repay a 15-year-old debt. On the 11th night, Matthew knocked on my door. Not texted. Knocked. I opened it. He stood there holding nothing. No food. No wine. No camera. Just himself. That feels ominous, I said. I considered bringing cookies. Why didn't you? I didn't want a prop. That is unfortunately mature. Can we walk? I looked past him toward his apartment. 1 block? If that's what you want. We went downstairs. The night was cool and clear. For the first block, Matthew talked about work. A courthouse. Bad lighting. A restoration architect who had described beige as historically sensitive. I listened. At the corner he stopped. Normally, this was where one of us asked for more time. This time he said, "There's an exhibition in Montreal in October." I waited. A photographer I've followed for years. I've wanted to see his work in person forever. Okay? I want to go. Good. I want you to come with me. There was no flourish. No ticket already purchased. No hotel secretly booked. No future arranged on my behalf. Just a want. Placed between us. My first instinct was to ask what it meant. Instead, I asked myself whether I wanted to go. I did. When? Second weekend. The cabin trip is the first. Matthew blinked. You committed to something in October? Try to contain yourself. I'm proud of you. Dangerous. He smiled. Then I said, yes. His expression softened. Yes? I want to go. He exhaled. I realized then that he had been nervous. Actually nervous. Matthew Sloane, who had once treated a flight to another continent like choosing a restaurant, was nervous, asking one man to make a plan months away. I haven't booked anything, he said. I assumed. I thought we could look together. Good. And Wesley? There was my full name again. I know something else. I waited. I want to be exclusive with you. My throat tightened. I want you in my ordinary life. I want Tuesdays and boring Sundays and arguments about dinner. I want to know what you're doing at Christmas, instead of pretending December is too far away to discuss. I smiled despite myself. I want to talk about where we live eventually. Not now. Not because our apartments share drywall and that's convenient. Because if this works, I want us to be able to discuss it without either of us treating the conversation like surrender. I looked at him. Matthew continued. I still can't tell you whether I want to get married. I know. But I can tell you I'm done using that uncertainty to avoid telling you everything I do want. For 15 years, I had imagined the right version of Matthew returning with a guarantee. He would say forever. He would say marriage. He would say he had been wrong to leave. And somehow those words would make the younger version of me safe retroactively. Standing on that street, I finally understood how little I wanted that fantasy. I wanted this man, the one who had loved someone else, lost someone else, changed, failed differently, learned imperfectly, come back into my life by accident, and stayed in it by choice. I want you too, I said. Matthew's eyes closed briefly. Present tense and future tense. He laughed. I stepped closer. I don't need you to promise you'll never change. I definitely will. That used to terrify me. And now? Now I need you to tell me when you do. Matthew nodded. I can promise that. That one I believe. He kissed me then, not like we were recovering 15 missing years, not like the universe had corrected an old mistake, like two men making a present-day choice with enough room for tomorrow to be discussed rather than predicted. We booked Montreal together 2 nights later, separate browser tabs, strong opinions about hotels, one minor argument about train times. It was perfect. A few weeks passed. Matthew remained next door. So did I. Nobody moved in. Nobody proposed. We simply became more present in each other's lives. Plans appeared on my calendar months ahead. Some changed. None of them became betrayal because they changed. Matthew occasionally said, I don't know, and I learned that the sentence was not automatically a threat. I occasionally said, I want, and discovered that wanting something out loud did not force the other person to surrender. Once, over dinner, Matthew told me he would rather spend Christmas morning with his mother and come back to Providence that afternoon. The younger version of me might have heard distance. I heard a preference. I told him I wanted Christmas Eve together. We made both things true. Another evening, I told him I was considering renewing my consulting contract for 2 years instead of 1. Matthew did not ask whether that meant I was staying for him. He asked whether I liked the work. I said yes. Then, after a moment, I said, and I like being here. He smiled, but did not turn the statement into anything larger than I had offered. That mattered too. The past never disappeared. Sometimes it arrived unexpectedly. A song in a store, a photograph Matthew found on an old hard drive, the particular brand of soap he still bought because apparently 15 years were not enough to reconsider Cedar, but memory stopped being the authority in the room. We could acknowledge what had happened without asking it to decide what happened next. One evening, months after the package room, Matthew and I returned from dinner and stopped at the entrance to our building. The neighborhood was quiet. A few windows above us were lit. For a moment, I thought about the absurdity of it. I had once believed permanence had to look like a house, an engagement, a set of plans nobody changed. Matthew had once believed freedom had to look like motion. We had both spent years protecting ourselves from the opposite fear. Then we had somehow ended up living one wall apart and learning that closeness was neither a trap nor a guarantee. Matthew glanced toward our usual corner. One more block? I looked at the building, then at him. There were still things we did not know. Whether we would ever marry, whether we would eventually live together, whether Providence would remain home in 10 years. whether the plans on my calendar would survive every change waiting for us. For the first time, those unanswered questions did not feel like exits. They felt like conversations we had not had yet. I slipped my hand into Matthew's. "Make it 2." He smiled, and we kept walking.